Austin Andrews here with your beacon. Today we take a look at European laws reaching the United States companies. As most Americans who've been paying attention to the news the last week have focused on debate bias and political polling, and over the last couple of days, a second assassination attempt with a gunman in direct proximity of President Trump, it is easy to miss stories like some of the things that are happening in the European Union. One such story is that of a new law passed in the EU, but the tendrils of this law will be vast. Ringing this alarm bell is Justin Haskins with The Blaze, who brought this issue up on Allie Beth Stuckey's podcast.
There's this new law that was passed in the European Union, which at first, most people, when they start to hear Europe, who cares?
Yeah.
It's like the first thing.
Yeah.
But it's going to impact every single American. It's called the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Essentially what it does is create ESG social credit scores for companies.
Now, as you may remember, a social credit score is like a citizenship score for people like you and I. Right now, you and I have credit scores, and we are judged by our credit history on how trustworthy we are on paying back a credit or debt. But in countries like China, people are also given citizenship scores that are based not only on money matters, but also political associations, personal associations, social media behavior, and so much more. ESG is a version of that social credit score that has begun to sprout up about businesses, and it stands for environmental social governance. Companies that are judged as being harmful to the environment, being socially unruly, or inspiring people to rebel against the societal norms, or are actively fighting or disobeying the government, are scored lower as compared to companies that toe the line. Haskins goes on to describe how these scores are designed to change companies' behavior.
These ESG scores are designed to transform the way companies operate, the kinds of products and services that they can sell, and then by extension, transform societies around it. So lots of climate change initiatives are in there, biodiversity rules, land and water use, all kinds of social justice.
LGBTQ.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. How diverse is your board of directors? How diverse is your management team? Like, these are the kinds of things that are in these ESG scores. Well, in the United States, there's no ESG law. There's no social credit scoring law. It's all being imposed by private companies, public-private partnerships between... Like BlackRock, exactly. A lot of these policies have actually been in place to varying degrees for a long, long time, but it was only recently that people started understanding what was going on. And so for a long time, they were moving the ball forward very, very slowly, and most people didn't notice it. I think they just thought, Target is moving to the left because the leadership at Target is kind of leans left and society kind of leans left. And it's all just moving in that direction very slowly. But in reality, there was this ESG stuff going on behind the scenes, and it was all just happening very slowly. Then around 2020 with COVID, everything ramped up huge. There was a real concerted effort to transform society quickly.
So we see how investment firms have tried to push the idea of ESG on companies through investment dollars and buying corporate stock. But now the European Union has stepped in and created an ESG law. Justin Haskins explains how that would affect companies in the United States.
This law that happened in the European Union, they finally passed it. It took them years to put it together. They passed it in May of this year, 2024. And unlike the ESG policies that we've been talking about so far, which are driven by the private sector, this is being driven by the government. So the European Union is codified these social credit scores for companies. Okay. So they came up with their own left-wing ideas and values. And they passed this law in 2024, and they said it applies to large companies that are based in the European Union or non-EU companies, large non-EU companies that do above a certain amount of revenue in the European Union. So, for example, Apple or McDonald's or companies like that, if they surpass this threshold of revenue, which is $489 million, then they have to adhere to these ESG rules as well.
The EU law doesn't just affect the aspects of the business that happen in the EU either. Haskins tells us more.
They don't have to adhere to the ESG rules only in the European Union. It has to be everywhere. So it's not enough for McDonald's or for Apple or for Meta or for Microsoft or for Google or for, and I could name a million other companies that this will apply to. It's not enough for them to change their policies in the EU. They have to change it in America. They have to change it everywhere they do business. That's what the law says. And if they don't, then they can be fined 5% of their total worldwide revenue. So for a company like Apple, if you do the math, that's $19 billion for one violation.
Wow.
So no one's going to violate this law because they can't afford to violate this law.
But the law goes even further.
It embeds all kinds of crazy left-wing things about climate change, social justice, all the stuff you would imagine would be in there is in there. But what makes it even crazier than that is that one of the requirements for these large companies that are covered under this law is that they have to impose it on almost all of the businesses that they work with in their supply chains upstream and downstream, no matter where they're located or how much business those companies do in the EU. So, for example, Ford would be covered under this law. Ford is a car company, sells cars in the EU above the threshold, so they have to adhere to it. They also have to make sure, Ford does, that all the businesses that they do business with in America are also doing these ESG scores. So you could be a rubber manufacturer in Ohio that does no business in Europe, but you make rubber for Ford. You also have to adhere to the EU rule. And Ford is going to be the one that imposes it on you through contractual assurances and other stuff. So if Ford doesn't do that, then Ford gets fined 5% of their total worldwide revenue. So obviously they're going to do this. So when you start playing out the ramifications of this, they're enormous. We're talking about if you're a potato farmer who sells potatoes to McDonald's in Idaho, you now have to adhere to these left-wing ESG rules, even though you don't do any business in the EU at all. Through this, you can transform the entire country, because you can transform hiring practices, business practices, the kinds of products that people sell and buy, the commitment to social justice goals generally. And none of this comes from an American law. It's all from this EU law.
And now we're left with the most obvious question. Can this be stopped?
The only way to stop it is to have a president and Congress. A president might be able to do some of this on their own because they do have a lot of power in negotiating trade deals and things like that. But you have to, at the very least, have the president. A Congress alone wouldn't be able to do it. Go to the EU and say, no. Like, you can do this to everybody else, but you can't do this to us. And the reason the United States can do that and Mexico can't is because the United States is needed more by the EU than we need the EU.
Folks, we are just scraping the surface of this issue. But if you want to hear more about this issue from Justin Haskins, you can listen into his interview with Allie Beth Stuckey on her podcast. But the stakes of this election, as high as they have felt, are even higher. Because we don't just need a president who will stand up to Putin in Russia, or Zelensky in Ukraine, or terrorists throughout the Middle East. But we also need a president and a Congress that will stand up to allies like the European Union, who are passing laws that will fundamentally change our way of life. I'm Austin Andrews, and I'll see you on the next report.